The train shrieked, a long, mournful cry that seemed to tear the fabric of the vast, indifferent sky. Elara pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the grit of the journey embedded in her skin, her clothes, her very spirit. Outside, the landscape was a study in brown and grey, a world bled of color and softness. This was redemption. The name, read on a smudged map weeks ago in the ashes of her old life, had sounded like a promise, a prayer. Now, seeing the hard-edged collection of wooden buildings huddled against the wind, it felt more like a judgment. She clutched the letter in her reticule, the paper worn soft as a prayer book from 100 readings. Mr. Alistair Barlow. His words had been proper, his penmanship firm. He wrote of a good house, of needing a companion to make it a home, of appreciating a woman with education and gentle breeding. He was offering a future to a woman who had none left. Her hope was a fragile, fluttering thing, a moth caught in her throat. She stepped down from the carriage onto the splintered platform, her city boots immediately filmed with pale dust. The air smelled of horse, hot metal, and something Elsean arid emptiness that filled her lungs. She pulled her shawl tighter, a flimsy defense against the stares that followed her progress. Women paused with their baskets, their eyes lingering on her worn but still fine wool coat. Men stopped their conversations, their gazes more direct, more assessing. She felt like a specimen under glass, her vulnerability a beacon in this land of hard certainties. The Mercantile was the town's beating heart. A dim space crowded with the scents of burlap, coffee beans, and chewing tobacco. A man stood by the counter, broad and thick in a waistcoat that strained at the buttons. He had a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that took her in from head to toe. This was not the man from her imagination, the distinguished gentleman whose prose had been so reassuring. This man looked less like a companion and more like a butcher appraising a cut of meat. "Mr. Barlow?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "You're the one, Elara," he said. It was not a question. His eyes narrowed. "You're thinner than your photograph suggested." He gestured to her single, scuffed valise. "Is that all you have?" She swallowed against a knot of dread. "Yes, mister. The letter, I wrote it before." Her voice faltered. How could she explain the fire? The speed with which it had consumed everything, her parents, her home, the small dowry she had saved from her teaching post. The letter she sent was from a woman with prospects. The woman standing before him was a ghost, a beggar. "There was a fire. I lost everything. I came with only what I had on my back and the funds from your train ticket." A terrible silence descended in the store. The proprietor froze in the act of weighing sugar. A woman near the fabric bolts turned, her face a mask of avid curiosity. Barlow's face, already ruddy, darkened to a furious plum. The geniality in his letter had been a fiction, a thin veneer over a core of pure, unyielding stone. "A fire," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "So you are not just a bride, you are a charity case, a penniless orphan seeking a benefactor." "No," she whispered, the word lost in the sudden roaring in her ears. "I can work. I am a capable teacher. I can keep a house. I did not advertise for a scullery maid," he boomed, his voice filling the store, spilling out into the dusty street. He took a step back from her, as if she carried a contagion. "I sent for a respectable partner, a woman of some means to help build a life. Not a wisp of a girl with nothing but sad stories and empty pockets. You have misrepresented yourself, deceived me." The accusation was a physical blow. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sickening. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the collective judgment of a town that had already decided her worth and found it wanting. "I did not mean to deceive," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I am an honest woman. Your honesty is of no value to me." He spat, turning his back on her with a final, contemptuous wave of his hand. The arrangement is void. You are on your own." He strode from the mercantile without a backward glance, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. A void where a future had been only moments before. She was stranded, a public disgrace. The silence he left behind was louder and more cruel than his words had been. No one moved to help. No one offered a kind word. They just watched. In the corner of the store, half hidden behind a stack of flour sacks, a man had watched the entire exchange. He was tall and lean, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He had said nothing, his expression unreadable. But as Elara stumbled out of the store, blinded by tears she refused to let fall, his gaze followed her, a flicker of something she could not name in his dark eyes. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the cruel edges of the town in shades of orange and blood. Elara walked, her legs moving without conscious thought. She had no destination. The street was a gauntlet of closed faces and shuttered windows. Each door she passed was a silent rejection. The wind picked up, a high, lonely sound that whipped her skirts around her ankles and chilled her to the bone. The prairie, stretching out to an infinite horizon, was not a place of opportunity. It was a vast, open grave, waiting to swallow her whole. She found herself at the edge of town, where the last shabby structures gave way to the endless, rustling grass. She sank onto a fallen log near a dry creek bed, her body finally surrendering to the despair that had been clawing at her. The valise, containing her few remaining possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, the photograph of two smiling parents, now turned to ash, sat beside her like a tombstone. She was undone. The hope that had carried her 1,000 miles had been snuffed out in a single brutal moment. Here, in a place called redemption, she had found none. Dusk was deepening into true night when the sound of a wagon creaking nearby broke through her stupor. She looked up, startled, her hand flying to her throat. It was the man from the store, the silent observer. He had pulled his wagon to a stop on the track a dozen yards away. He did not approach her directly, but got down and began checking the harnesses of his two sturdy horses, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was a looming silhouette against the last light, a man who seemed part of the harsh landscape itself. Minutes passed. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the soft jingle of a harness buckle. He did not speak. He did not look at her. Then, with the same quiet economy of motion, he took a thick wool blanket from the wagon bed, walked halfway toward her, and laid it on the ground. It was an offering, a question without words. Elara stared at the blanket, then at the man. His face was still in shadow, unreadable, but his posture was not threatening. It was simply there. He was waiting. Fear warred with a primal need for shelter. The other men in town had looked at her with contempt or a hungry kind of pity. This man's gaze, when he finally lifted his head to meet hers, was different. It held no judgment. It was as steady and plain as the earth beneath her feet. It was the gaze of someone who understood what it meant to be alone. Another gust of wind, colder this time, made the decision for her. Shivering, she rose on trembling legs. Leaving her valise for a moment, she walked to the blanket, picked it up, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled of wool, leather, and clean dust. It was warmth. It was a choice. When she turned back, he had already retrieved her bag and placed it in the wagon. He gestured with his head toward the seat. It was an invitation to a future she could not see, offered by a stranger who had not spoken a single word to her. With nothing left to lose, she walked to the wagon and allowed him to help her up onto the hard wooden seat. The journey to his ranch was a silent passage through a world of silver and shadow. The moon had risen, stark and bright, bleaching the color from the plains and carving the distant mesas into sleeping giants. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the vast, whispering emptiness of the land. Elara sat ramrod straight, clutching the blanket, her mind a numb void. The man beside her, whose name she did not even know, handled the reins with a quiet competence. He seemed to draw stillness from the night itself. His homestead was a small cabin and a solid-looking barn, huddled in the protective curve of a low ridge. It was isolated, a solitary outpost of human endeavor against the immense wilderness. There were no welcoming lights, no sounds of life other than the nicker of the horses as they approached. This was a place of profound solitude, and she understood, with a sinking heart, that she had just traded one form of isolation for another. He led her inside the cabin. A single lantern cast a pool of wavering golden light, revealing a room that was meticulously clean but achingly bare. A stone hearth, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few books and tin plates. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and needed little. He gestured towards the hearth, where embers still glowed faintly. "There's wood in the box," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough with disuse, but not unkind. It was the first time he had spoken to her. He set her valise by the door. "The loft is yours, there are blankets." He then turned and left, heading toward the barn to tend to his animals, leaving her alone in the charged silence of his home. Elara climbed the ladder to the small loft. It was just a sparsy, straw-stuffed mattress on the floorboards and a stack of clean, heavy quilts. Exhaustion, cold, and a bone-deep weariness finally overwhelmed her. She didn't bother to undress, simply collapsing onto the mattress and pulling the quilts over her, the scent of cedar and wood smoke a strange comfort. Sleep came not as a rest, but as a dark, dreamless fall into oblivion. The days that followed unfolded in a quiet, cautious rhythm. His name, she learned, was Silas. He did not offer it. She saw it carved into the handle of a tool. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and by the time she descended from the loft, he would be gone, tending to the enigmatic work of his ranch. He left coffee warming by the hearth and, on the second day, a small sack of flour and a tin of lard on the table. It was a silent negotiation. He would provide the roof and the substance. She, in return, would make this space a shelter. So she worked. She swept the floors until the planks shone. She scrubbed the table and washed the few dishes. She took his worn shirts and mended them with neat, almost invisible stitches, a skill her mother had insisted upon. She baked bread, the simple, domestic act, a balm to her frayed soul. The aroma filled the small cabin, a scent of life and normalcy that pushed back against the stark emptiness. They ate their meals in silence, sitting at opposite ends of the table. The quiet was not hostile, but it was heavy with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of the lives they had both lived before this strange intersection. She learned him in pieces, the way he held his shoulders, as if carrying a permanent weight, the gentleness of his large, calloused hands when he treated a lame horse, the profound sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he stared into the fire, lost in a place she could not go. He learned her too. He saw the resilience that straightened her spine, the innate grace in her movements, the way she would talk softly to the birds that came to peck at the crumbs she left out. He noticed the book she read over and over her mother's Bibland, the way her fingers would trace the gilded letters on the cover. He saw a woman of deep feeling and quiet strength, a woman who had been grievously wronged. The dam of her composure broke on the 5th night. A storm had blown in, a furious assault of wind and rain that rattled the cabin's single window. The sound was too much like the roar of the fire, the terrible, hungry sound that had consumed her world. A sob escaped her, then another. She pressed her hands to her mouth, horrified at the loss of control, but the grief was a flood, unstoppable. Silas, who had been cleaning a rifle by the firelight, went still. He did not rush to comfort her, did not offer platitudes. He simply sat and waited, giving her the dignity of her sorrow. When the first wave of weeping subsided, leaving her shuddering and spent, he spoke, his voice calm and even. "Tell me," and so she did. The words poured out of her. The story of her quiet life as a schoolteacher, the love she bore her parents, the sudden violent horror of the fire. She spoke of the suffocation, the loss, the utter desolation that had followed. She confessed the foolish hope she had placed in Mr. Barlow's letter, how she had seen it as a sign from God, a promise of a new beginning. She laid her entire broken heart bare on the rough-hewn table between them. He listened to it all without a single interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper. The cabin was silent, but for the drumming of the rain. The space between them no longer felt empty, it was filled with the truth of her pain. He looked into the fire, his jaw tight. "I had a wife," he said, the words pulled from a deep, wounded place. "And a son, little Tom." He paused, and she could see the effort it cost him to continue. Fever took them both. One winter, 2 years ago now. This place, it gets quiet. He did not say more, but he did not need to. In that spare, painful confession, he had offered her a piece of his own shattered past. It was a gift of immense value, a bridge built across the chasm of their shared loneliness. For the first time since arriving in this unforgiving land, Ilara did not feel entirely alone. They were two solitary souls, shipwrecked by life, who had found a temporary, fragile harbor in a storm. A routine, delicate as a spider's web, began to form in the weeks that followed. The silence between them softened, losing its sharp edges. It became a comfortable, companionable quiet, punctuated by necessary questions and brief observations. Ilara discovered a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin, and with Silas's unspoken permission, began turning the soil. He left a packet of vegetable seeds on the table for her one morning, and the simple gesture felt as intimate as a spoken endearment. Planting the seeds, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead, a sense of the future. The world outside their secluded ridge, however, had not forgotten her. Silas had to ride into redemption for supplies, and he returned with his jaw set in a hard line, a thunderous quiet emanating from him. The gossip, he told her tersely, had soured. Barlow, his pride wounded, had painted her as a conniving seductress, a woman of loose morals who had latched onto a reclusive rancher. The town, eager for a villain, had accepted his version of the story. The intrusion came a few days later in the form of the town preacher, Mr. Hobbs, and a stern-faced deacon. They arrived unannounced, their buggy kicking up a cloud of righteous dust. Mr. Hobbs, a man with a soft body and hard eyes, surveyed the cabin and Ilara's presence with open disapproval. "Mr. Kane," the preacher began, addressing Silas, who stood on the porch, blocking the doorway like a sentinel. "The good people of Redemption are concerned about this arrangement. It is unseemly. A young, unmarried woman living under your roof." "She needed shelter," Silas said, his voice flat and final. "There are proper channels for charity," the deacon chimed in, his gaze lingering on Ilara with disdain. "For a woman of her reputation to be living in sin." A cold fury, something Ilara had never felt before, rose in her chest. Before Silas could respond, she stepped forward from behind him. Her hands were clasped at her waist, her posture erect. She was no longer the weeping girl on the log. She was a woman in her own home. "There is no sin here, sirs," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Only kindness. Something you seem to know little about. I was cast out, and this good man took me in. If that is an offense to your sensibilities, then I suggest you examine your own Christian charity rather than my circumstances." The two men were stunned into silence, clearly unprepared for her to speak, let alone with such force. Silas looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. But the true test came a week later. She was weeding her small, hopeful garden when a horse and rider appeared over the ridge. It was Alistair Barlow. He dismounted, his face smug and cruel. He had come to enjoy his handiwork, to see the woman he had ruined. "Well, well," he sneered, his eyes raking over her simple dress and dirt-smudged hands. "Fallen far, haven't we? From a schoolteacher to a recluse's whore. I knew you were trash the moment I saw you." The word struck her, but it did not break her. She simply straightened up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You know nothing about me, Mr. Barlow. I know you're trespassing on this land, just as you trespassed on my good nature," he said, taking a menacing step closer. "Perhaps I should have the sheriff remove you." "That won't be necessary." Silas's voice came from the barn. He walked towards them, not with haste, but with a lethal deliberation that made Barlow pause. He carried a heavy wrench in one hand, and he did not bother to hide it. He stopped beside Elara, placing himself between her and the other man. His presence was an unbreachable wall. He looked directly at Barlow, his eyes cold as river stones. "This is my property, and this is my wife." The words hung in the air, solid and irrefutable. Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was a lie, a magnificent, protective lie. It was a shield he had forged for her in an instant. Barlow stared, his mouth agape. He had expected a cowering woman and an indifferent hermit. He was faced with a united front, a fortress he could not breach. He sputtered, searching for a retort, but Silas's unwavering stare defeated him. With a curse, Barlow remounted his horse and galloped away, his malice thwarted by a simple, powerful declaration. Elara and Silas stood together in the silence, the unspoken truth of his words echoing between them, changing everything. Barlow, however, was not a man to accept defeat. His rage, denied a direct outlet, festered and sought a new weapon. He was a man of some influence, with stakes in the town's water company. A few days after the confrontation, the creek that ran through Silas's property, the lifeblood of his small ranch, slowed to a trickle. Barlow had found a way to wound them without setting foot on their land. He was strangling them from a distance. The crisis descended swiftly. The garden wilted under the relentless sun. The horses and few cattle grew restless and gaunt. The future, which had begun to feel like a tangible thing, was drying up with the creek bed. Desperation began to creep back into the cabin, a cold, familiar ghost. But this time, Elara was not alone in facing it. "There's an old spring high up the ridge," Silas told her one evening, his face etched with worry as he stared at a map. "It's on my land. But the pipe that fed it to the lower pasture collapsed years ago. I never had the need to fix it." "Then we will fix it now," Elara said, her voice resolute. She was no longer a passenger in this life. She was a partner. The work was brutal, back-breaking labor. They spent their days under the searing sun, digging a new trench along the rocky slope of the ridge. The ground was hard, unforgiving. Her hands, accustomed to books and needles, were soon blistered and raw. Her muscles screamed in protest. But she did not stop. She hauled rocks, dug with a shovel that seemed to weigh as much as she did, and worked side by side with Silas. He would watch her, a look of grim astonishment on his face, as she refused to quit, her small frame powered by a formidable will. In their shared exhaustion, a new intimacy was forged. They no longer needed words. A shared look, the passing of a canteen of precious water, a hand offered to help her over a difficult patch of rock, these became their language. He saw her not as a fragile woman to be protected, but as an equal, a fighter with a spirit as tough as the unyielding land. She, in turn, saw the steadfast core of him, the quiet man who would move mountains, or at least dig through one, to protect what was his. Their partnership, born of necessity, was solidifying into something deeper, something unbreakable. The lie he had told Barlow's wife was becoming a truth in all but name. The day they finally cleared the last of the blockage and the first cool, clean trickle of water began to flow down the newly laid pipe, was a day of quiet triumph. Ilara sank to the ground, covered in dirt and sweat, and laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Silas stood over her, leaning on his shovel, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing years of grief. In that moment, watching the water of life flow towards their home, they had won. They had faced the crisis together and emerged stronger, their bond sealed not by vows, but by shared earth and sweat and an unwavering commitment to survival. Their victory was short-lived. Barlow, learning of the new water source, was incandescent with fury. His power had been circumvented, his control challenged. This was no longer about a slighted mail-order bride, it was a battle for dominance. He gathered 2 rough-looking men from the saloon, men who worked for loyalty bought with whiskey, and rode for Silas's ranch at dusk. He would not be denied his revenge. They were sitting on the porch, a rare moment of rest. When the sound of approaching riders reached them, Silas stood immediately, his body tensing. "Go inside, Ilara. Lock the door." "No," she said, rising to stand beside him. "We faced the drought together. We will face this together." He looked at her, at the defiant set of her jaw, and gave a short, sharp nod. He disappeared into the cabin and returned with his rifle, its metal glinting in the fading light. Barlow and his men reined in their horses at the edge of the yard, their figures menacing silhouettes. "Cain," Barlow bellowed, "this foolishness ends tonight. This ranch, this water it, should belong to a man who knows how to use it, a man of standing. You will sign the deed over to me, or we will burn you out." Silas raised the rifle, resting it calmly in the crook of his arm. "This is my land. You are trespassing." It was then that Ilara stepped forward. All eyes went to her. Barlow had expected her to be cowering inside. "Mr. Barlow," she began, her voice carrying with the clear, commanding tone of a schoolteacher addressing a recalcitrant classroom. "You speak of standing. What standing does a man have who would publicly humiliate a defenseless woman? What standing does a man have who would illegally divert water, threatening the livelihood of his neighbor? What standing does a man have who must hire bullies to fight his battles for him?" She took another step, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice never wavered. "You are not a man of standing. You are a coward and a hypocrite. This is our home. We built it with our hands and our hearts, and you will not have it." A stunned silence fell. Barlow, who dealt in brute force and intimidation, had no defense against the truth, spoken so plainly and fearlessly. His 2 hired men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. This was not the simple eviction they had been paid for. "You'll regret this, you little," Barlow snarled, raising his arm as if to urge his men forward. "That's far enough, Barlow." The voice came from the track leading to the ranch. 2 more riders had arrived, unnoticed in the tense standoff. It was the sheriff, a grizzled man named Peters, and with him, the owner of the mercantile. The shopkeeper had been the first to witness Barlow's cruelty, and Silas's quiet decency on his supply runs had clearly made a greater impression than Barlow's blustering. Sheriff Peters nudged his horse forward. "I've had a few reports about you interfering with the creek, Barlow. Damming up a waterway is a serious offense. And now you're here, making armed threats?" He looked from Barlow's enraged face to the resolute couple on the porch. He saw Silas, a man known for his solitude but also for his honesty. He saw Ilara, no longer a pitiful victim but a woman of formidable courage. He made his choice. "You and your men will ride out," the sheriff said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Now, and if I hear one more word about you bothering these folks, the next conversation we have will be in a jail cell." Defeated, humiliated in front of the very men whose respect he craved, Barlow was left with no recourse. His power, built on fear and bluster, had crumbled. He shot a look of pure hatred at Ilara and Silas before wheeling his horse around and riding off into the darkness, his hired thugs trailing behind him like scolded dogs. The threat was gone. The night was suddenly, profoundly quiet. Sheriff Peters tipped his hat. "Mr. Kane, ma'am." He turned his horse and, with the mercantile owner, rode away, leaving them in the peaceful aftermath of the storm. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs suddenly weak. Silas set the rifle down and turned to her. In the pale moonlight, he reached out and his hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't known she'd shed. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a confirmation of everything that had passed between them. The home she had defended was real. The partnership they had forged was real. The future was theirs to claim. In the days that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the ranch. The neutralization of Barlow's threat had been complete. His public shaming by the sheriff had eroded his standing, leaving him a bitter but impotent figure in the town. The water flowed freely in the creek, and Ilara's garden, revived and flourishing, became a vibrant splash of green against the brown earth. It was a testament to their endurance, a living symbol of the life they were coaxing from the hard land. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It was a home. Ilara's touch was everywhere now, in the clean curtains she had sewn for the window, in the jars of preserved vegetables lining the shelves, in the wildflower she kept in a tin cup on the table. She had filled the empty spaces not just with things, but with a sense of belonging. Silas, in turn, seemed to stand straighter, the permanent weight on his shoulders having lessened. The profound sadness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet contentment, a warmth that was reserved only for her. Their relationship, born in crisis and forged in labor, now bloomed in the calm. The lie he had told to protect her had become their unspoken truth. They were husband and wife in every way that mattered. They were partners in work, in spirit, in the silent language of their hearts. The community, led by the sheriff's example, had shifted its opinion. When they rode into town for supplies, they were no longer met with stares of judgment, but with nods of respect. Ilara's courage and Silas's steadfastness had earned them a place. They were no longer the outcast and the charity case. They were the Kanes of Ridgeback Ranch. One evening, as the sun set in a spectacular blaze of purple and gold, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the landscape soften in the twilight. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls. Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that first night? I was so afraid. I thought my life was over." Silas put his arm around her, drawing her closer. "My life was over," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Or I thought it was. This place was just a shell, a place to wait out the end." He paused, looking out at the ranch, at the sturdy barn and the thriving garden. "You brought the life back, Ilara." She turned her face up to his. His eyes, so often guarded and shadowed, were clear and full of a deep, abiding love that mirrored her own. He had not rescued her with grand gestures or eloquent speeches. He had saved her by listening, by seeing the woman she was behind, the misfortune that clung to her. He had offered a blanket, a roof, a name. He had given her a place to plant her feet and the strength to stand her ground. In saving her, he had saved himself. Here, on the edge of a world that had tried to break them both, they had found more than just redemption. They had found sanctuary. They had built a family from the ashes of their pasts, a bond stronger than blood or convention. The future was no longer an unknown terror but a shared path, stretching out before them under the vast, watchful sky, as promising and peaceful as the land they now called home.